Hello everybody and welcome to NQA's first broadcast of 2017 regarding migration from OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. My name is Terry Fisher, I'm NQA's Principal OHSAS Assessor and I'll be taking you through the presentation. So firstly, as we go through the presentation, if you've got any questions, can you please fill them in as we go and they'll pop up on my screen. And then I'll be able to see the questions as we go through. Don't wait to the end. It's fine for you to do them as we go so that we can get a feel for what people need to understand. So firstly, if we have a quick overview of why implement a management system, we're looking particularly at 45001, but basically this includes any occupational health and safety management system. We're looking to achieve enhanced performance, hoping to deliver cultural change based on risk-based thinking and worker engagement. We're looking for a proactive risk management system which gives us a systematic approach to reduce culpability and increase protection of our workers. To enable this, we need proven commitment from both the leadership of an organisation, action and activities to deliver ongoing improvement as we go through the cycle. As most of you will be aware, ISO 45001 is based on an Annex SL structure, which is basically broken down into 10 component elements. The first 3 refer to the management system standard itself, and the actual operational side of things as far as we're concerned as clients and subscribers to the standard start from section 4 right through to 10. As I said at the start, this is what we're trying to achieve. The center of and the purpose of having an occupational management system. Section 4, we look at the organizational context, the external issues, the internal issues, the activities and purposes of the organization. Also in section 4, we try and identify the interested parties and the compliance requirements, both in terms of workers, the legal, regulatory and commercial considerations, and the interested parties associated with those. In section 5, we're looking at leadership, the strategy, the policy, the roles, responsibility, and the participation and engagement with workers. Section 6 is the planning. That's the hazard identification, the risk and opportunities, and taking actions to reduce and promote improvement, compliance obligations, and identifying objectives and targets to deliver continual improvement of the system as it develops. Section 7 and Section 8 is operational support, looking at resources, competence, awareness, communication and documented information, and the operational control of the activities themselves. This also includes hierarchy of control, risk reduction measures, the management of change, looking at procurement and contractors, and emergency preparedness. In Section 9, it's the evaluation and improvement section. In sections 9 and 10, we've got internal audits, we've got management review, incident and corrective actions, improvement objectives, and improvement processes generally. That gives you a very brief overview of how the management system is structured according to the revised Annex SL framework. So, the starting point of the occupational health and safety management system is fundamentally the scope. What we need to do is look at what we need to manage, identify the risks and opportunities within that process, look at what we can do to improve that, take control, risk reduction measures, etc., giving us ongoing improvement and risk reduction. The focus here is on workers' risk and occupational health and safety. So we're not just talking about accidents with cut fingers, we're talking about occupational health, disease, stress, all the wide range of activities that can come under those two things. So it's not just looking at cut fingers and direct injuries. To help us identify the scope of the management system and what we can influence, we first need to understand the context of the organisation. What is it we do and why do we do it? And who are the interested parties in relation to the operations of the organisation? And also, what do they require from us, the strategic direction of the organisation? So that's the context. The workers are the primary interested party, but there are others, can be suppliers, can be neighbours, can be strategic owners of the business, etc. And the leadership, obviously, what the organisation wants to achieve for its own commercial well-being can have a major influence on people's health and safety. If you consider, if you're manufacturing ball bearings and all of a sudden you want to manufacture glass plate, then you can see by changing that strategic direction of a business, it can have a huge impact on the knowledge and requirements of the organisation and the resources, etc. So that's why leadership and the commitment to promote the protection of workers is fundamental to the operation of the management system. So the context of the organisation, if we compare some different examples here, a water company, maybe a public limited company, the context for that will be different to a university potentially, with educational establishments and educational requirements and different interested parties as they go, a food manufacturer, a family-owned engineering business. All of these are typical examples of the types of industry that may well use a management system, but they all vary vastly in their context and what they need and who potentially are the interested parties and what are the requirements based on them. So it's worth considering that a little more, because this is basically one of the primary changes. The context of the organisation is a primary change. It's a new introduction of the ISO management system requirements. The context is basically trying to capture and understand why do you do what you do? What are the statutory obligations? What are the interested parties? What do they want from you? And how do you deliver it? That's why understanding the context of the organisation and understanding the needs and expectations of the interested parties are critical to any management system. This doesn't only apply to occupational health, it applies to all of the new ISO management systems, both in 9001 and 14001. We need to look at the external interested parties in the context and the external. These could be mandatory statutory obligations, these could be owners, this could be neighbours, it could be anybody who has an interest or influence on the business. But it certainly includes, in this context for occupational health and safety, the workers and people that work on behalf of the organisation. So that can also include contractors and agency members, etc. I won't be going through the standard clause by clause. I'll just be giving a very brief overview of what the clause context is. As we go through this now, it's quite an opportune time. As some of you may be aware, the ISO 45001 DIS 2 is due for public consultation commencing the 19th of May. For those of you with a direct interest, you can purchase a copy of the standard should you choose to go through that in preparation, but you must be aware this is just the second draft. It's not at final publication stage or final draft. This is the second phase of the consultation period because of the revisions to DIS 1. So the DIS bit is the draft international standard. So just to overview then section 4, in the clauses of the standard, you've got obviously the context of the organisation as the main header, and then the subheadings for that is understanding the organisation and its context. So what do you do? Where is it you do it? In what culture, etc., what setting? Understanding the needs and expectations of workers primarily and other interested parties. But workers are the primary group that we're interested in because obviously we're trying to protect workers' health. Other interested parties may include stakeholders, as in owners, as in neighbours, suppliers, etc. And once we understand the organisation and its context, what it's trying to achieve, and what its expectations are of its interested parties, then we can determine the scope of the management system. And then we can look at how we develop the management system around that scope. Here are some examples of internal and external factors and how we can look at that. You could consider internal, external, well, certainly external factors with both legal terms, political, economic, social, technology, environmental. All these things can have an influence on the management system and the organisation. Internal factors could be regarded as strategy, the structure, the style, the staff, the skills, and the systems already deployed and resources within the company itself. As I mentioned earlier, ISO 45001 is the draft version of the third of the revisions to the management standard suite. There is an existing ISO 14001-2015 which uses a similar structure, the Annex SL framework, the 9001-2015 which also uses the similar structure, and this is the third addition to that we're talking about with 45001, this DIS 2, and the context and the interested parties are the fundamental start for all three elements, all three standards. So the scope of the management system define the boundaries and applicability of the management system as it applies to your organisation. So it's up to the company to define its own boundaries associated with its risks and hazards, etc., in its activities. You can only do that once you've identified the context of the organisation and the workers and the interested parties within it. As an overview to section 5, the leadership section of the management standard, in essence, it emphasises leadership, not just management. So it's not just about the head of an organisation saying, well, that's his job or her job. I don't need to interest myself. Let them get on with it. It's about actively engaging at all levels of the organisation, and the leadership have a primary role to play in the success or failure of a management system. The more engagement and more commitment you have from a leadership team and level of commitment is increased, generally the level of commitment and resources and various things. And resources doesn't just relate to financial resources, it can relate to time, the actual will and willingness for the organisation to consider these things in a very busy working schedule, a commercial environment. It needs to be a fundamental part of what the business does. It's not about having an add-on, oh, we need to produce this service, this product, oh, and by the way, we need to consider health and safety of our staff. Health and safety of the staff is a fundamental consideration of the organisation as a matter of routine, and that takes leadership. I can't go through the standard or the DIS clause by clause. All I can say is, in principle, that's the headings there. You can see 5.1, it's leadership and worker participation, leadership and commitment. There are more clauses been added. It was previously A to K clauses, it's now A to M. So there's been some wording changes and some additional clauses added in there from the first DIS. And the occupational policy, it's the commitment to health and safety working conditions, to prevention of work-related injury and ill health, not just the accidents and cut fingers, etc. So it's the full range of an individual's well-being and health that's appropriate to the occupational activity. There's been a change in the next clause, 5.3, organisational roles, responsibilities and authorities. The phrase accountabilities has been dropped from this draft standard. So they've dropped that phrase from the actual title of the clause, but it is as a sub-clause mentioned in there about accountability. And it also talks about accountabilities and responsibilities, etc., all needing to be demonstrated in documented information. So there needs to be some evidence, not just a statement of, oh, well, that's Charlie's job. It needs to be documented in some ways, defined as to what the responsibilities and authorities are for that particular role. Also in this section under the leadership is the consultation and participation of workers. This is a key, as I've said many times, it's a key element to the management system, and some revisions have taken place since DIS 1. This is just an overview. I can't go through each clause and tell you each revision individually. It would take too long, and it would only cloud the issue to some extent. So we're looking at the mechanisms and removal of barriers. We're looking at the commitment for time and resources. We're looking at information that needs to come from leaders and communicating and training that knowledge and that understanding of what requirements are and enabling those things to happen. It's about engaging with the staff and the workers to positively identify and engage not just with the activity of the task, but the identification and controls, and all the other elements of the management system, even up to including the policy, the way it's worded, how it can be interpreted. Good discussion at all levels throughout the organisation, and communication and engagement is key to success in any management system, but it certainly is in terms of occupational health and safety. It's no good saying, oh, well, I told him not to do that, if the communication was ineffective and he then injures themselves because they didn't understand what the requirements were. Very fundamental to the system. In essence, planning is about defining the actions required to successfully achieve the occupational health and safety system, outcomes and objectives, to address the risks and opportunities and meet the compliance obligations whilst engaging with workers to identify the best way forward, or the most appropriate way forward given that circumstance within the organisation at that time. It also talks about, in section 6, the hierarchy of controls and the various things there. So I've put on the slide the quick diagram of the hierarchy of controls. Obviously, elimination being the most effective control from a hazard. substitute the hazard for something less hazardous, engineering controls, isolate people from the hazard, administrative controls, giving instructions and procedures and changing the way people work is towards the bottom. But the least effective of all these is personal protection equipment. And that's not a reflection on the quality of the personal protection equipment. It's a reflection on, in the hierarchy of controls that you can adopt, PPE is the last line of defence and should be considered last when you've evaluated and implemented as much of the following previous ones prior to PPE. So don't just rely on PPE as the primary defence and think, well, we've issued some gloves or whatever, so it'll be fine. It's the last line of defence when you're looking at risk reduction. In section 6, as we say, we're looking at actions to address risks and opportunities. Some changes to the clauses and titles and contents has taken place. The ones here now reflect DIS 2 requirements. For those of you who are very familiar with DIS 1, you can may be able to identify some minor changes, but you can see there the principles are, when we're looking at the planning, the general planning requirement, looking at hazard identification and assessment of risks and opportunities, determination of legal and other requirements. So not only do we need to reduce the risk, but we also need to comply with other compliance requirements, both legal and non-statutory. So, you know, it could be organisational requirements. The legal requirement could be one thing, but the organisation may require something more stringent because of its corporate culture and policy. And then the planning to take that action and enabling those resources to be available, etc. It also talks about in 6.2 occupational objectives and planning to achieve them. So it's not just about setting objectives, you know, I want to reduce lost time incidents by 30% on the previous year. It's, well, how are we going to do that? What do we need to do? How do we think what's going to be the most effective method? And as I say, this engagement with staff and workers at this planning stage can be quite a key element. The better we plan, the better we can resource, and the more effective the outcome and more improvement we can gain, the most effective and efficient way. So if we just look at the overall plan, do, check, act model, we look at risk assessments. We need to look at risk assessments as potentially the primary hub in the wheel, because if we haven't risk assessed, how do we know what we need to control? The policy of the organisation can influence the types of controls, as I've said, when we talked about PPE and the various things and the commitment. The objectives drive forward the improvements that we need to achieve or that we desire to achieve. The effectiveness of the control and the actual operational controls that actually in reality take place. Reviewing all that information that's being generated, the number of accidents, incidents, etc. Using that then for improvement, and the cycle begins again. So that's the plan, do, check, act model in its entirety as far as the management system is concerned in very broad terms. Obviously, the standard itself goes into a lot more clauses and a lot more detail of the requirements, but you can see the principles of that and how it works using the plan, do, check, act model. In essence, leaders of the organisations need to provide resources, information, strategy necessary for the establishment, maintenance and continual improvement of the management system. This will also need some support, both in terms of time and commitment, and some resources maybe in terms of new equipment or different types of working, etc. It will be information in relation to, well, this is what we want to achieve. How do you think we can achieve it? And that information has to be two-way. So it's not just a management system that says, we as the management have said we're going to do it this way. It needs to be fully engaged with the workers, because at the end of the day, these are the people that potentially know their roles best, and you should use that knowledge to best advantage within your management system. It may require some training, some skill development on all levels. You know, it could be managers that need some training in safety awareness or principles of safety. It could be training of staff that have been put into a new role. It could be training of staff because of new resources that are being introduced because of a change. All these things can influence and change the dynamics within a particular operation. But added together, they all need supporting, and this is a principal part of the leadership of the organisation and the management commitment. So within the support section 7 clauses of the standard, we look at resources, we look at competence, we're looking at awareness, and one of the revisions to the DIS 1 was communication, and the clause has been expanded slightly there. And obviously documented information then in relation to that, because sometimes we need the documented information, whether it be work instructions, safe systems of work, method statements, call them what you will. There's a whole range of activity there. In standard terminology, when we talk about documented information, it doesn't necessarily mean physically pieces of paper. It talks about documented information as can be on any media, so it can be electronic, visual, etc., etc. But there has to be some method there to demonstrate this is what we're trying to achieve, etc., etc. So when we talk about documented information, we're not just talking about hard copy documents. It can be electronic information. It's things to support and be able to justify, yeah, we do that. Well, can you show me? Yep, and there's some of the stuff that we use. So it's quite a wide remit now. It's not just talking about documented procedures, as you would have been familiar with in other management systems. In section 8, we're looking at the operational controls. And this area is quite fundamental. Obviously, this is the actual interface between all the things we've talked about before, the engagement, the resources, the technical competence, the knowledge, the know-how, the strategy, the information, coming together to actually take shape within the commercial environment. Slight change there in the clauses. We've got 8.1 as operational planning and control and 8.2 in emergency preparedness and response. They're the only two clauses now within that. They are quite extensive clauses with sub-clauses within them, but that's basically the two primary headers of the clauses there, and there are obviously sub-clauses beneath that within the new standard. After the operational control, one of the things we want to do as part of that, we want to monitor and measure, and performance evaluation is the next key step in the management system cycle. So there's been a range of changes for this within this DIS 2. The main header hasn't changed for 9.1, it's still monitoring, measurement and analysis, but they've added the word performance evaluation. And they've also revised 9.1.2 and with regard to the evaluation of compliance. So in general terms, it says that in principle, under the general requirements of monitoring and measurement, the company need to understand how they can confirm that a particular activity or whatever is effectively being delivered. The process is delivering the desired outcome for that activity. And the same applies in health and safety terms. How do you know it's working? So you need to understand what you're going to measure, at what frequency, and what's going to be the acceptable level of that measurement. That's the general requirement of monitoring and measurement and analysis. And then added to that, you've got the evaluation of compliance, which is looking specifically both at statutory things, so you're complying within the company's policies, etc., to comply with legal and statutory requirements. So it's the evaluation of, well, how do you know you've complied? A knowledge of what the statutory requirements are is not the evaluation of compliance. The evaluation of compliance is, we know what the requirements are, we've done this to meet those requirements, and we've done something else to confirm that those requirements that we've put in place, those controls, meet the legal requirements, are effectively delivering that compliance. That's the evaluation of compliance. So it's not just having the knowledge of what you need to do, it's actually checking and making sure that the controls are effectively delivering what you wanted them to in relation to the compliance requirements that you've identified for your organisation. Okay. Next one, 9.2, general internal audit requirements, talks about the usual things. There's no real changes there. With regard to that, it's looking at the general requirements of checking and using the audit programs as part of this monitoring and measurement and analysis, and looking at the internal audit program itself. So that's basically 9.2. And 9.3, management review. There has been some word changes, and it's a slightly bigger clause now in DIS 2 than it was in DIS 1. The basic principles are the same, but you need to look at the standard to understand them specifically for each particular subsection. So the basic principles of management review hasn't changed, but there are some wording changes and there are some expansion of changes within that. Improvement. There's some changes again to the clauses. So 10.1 now is generally looking at the general requirements for driving forward continual improvement as a primary objective of the management system. Looking at incidents, non-conformity and corrective actions in 10.2. And the measurement and continual improvement there, looking at objectives and the processes within the management system. So it's going round full circle to deliver continual improvement, not continuous. So there again, slightly different model, looking at the leadership, the planning, the support, the performance evaluation and improvement, then reviewing that, look at it again, and round the cycle goes, looking at the plan, do, check, act. Just in this scenario, I've put leadership as a central driver to that, because without knowing the strategic direction, the requirements of the business, etc., 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 and having the resources to do that, it becomes increasingly difficult to drive and develop an improving system. There again, just an overview there. Internal, external issues. If we think of it as a process approach, so we've got internal and external issues coming in, the context of the organisation and the needs and expectations of relevant interested parties. That's the management system process in the centre. And then to the side of that, we've got enhanced performance, protection of staff and workers, engagement and participation, culture change, fulfilment and satisfaction of compliance obligations, both statutory and non-statutory ones. So that's looking at it as a very simplistic process model, inputs, the activity and the outputs. What we will be able to do as time commences and we get to having the final draft and the published version of 45001, we will be able to carry out gap analysis against an existing system to identify any potential gaps or weaknesses for the transition from 18001 to 45001. We've already got a gap analysis document. As DIS 2 has just been released for consultation, we are looking to revise this document because some of the wording, this was based on DIS 1, but that's available from our website. By all means, use that as an aid to look at the terminology changes. We've tried to explain in simple terms, you know, the phrases, context and the various things like that. So it's written in more understandable language, and you can use that and download that from our website. As I say, we will be revising this in the coming weeks. Just to make it clear, when we scheduled this webinar, we weren't aware that DIS 2 was going to be published just a few days before this webinar. So for those of you who want to participate in the consultation period of the 45,001 DIS 2 consultation, public consultation actually commences on the 19th of May. And you can go onto the BSI website and have your input directly to that, to have your part in developing the standard to make it as effective and as appropriate for the whole of industry and commerce going forward. That's our gap analysis document. It's available on the website, as I've said. If you need to use that, by all means do so. Remember, if your business hasn't currently got an occupational health and safety management system, by all means, don't be frightened of introducing the existing system, OHSAS 18001-2007. It's still available, and based on previous years, previous introductions of standards would be applicable as from the publication for 3 years, as from the publication date of 45001. So when ISO 45001 finally gets published, from that point on, we would expect to see a 3-year transition. Obviously, if you need a management system now, don't wait. Use 18001, and then at any time within that post-publication of 45001, you can make arrangement to transition up to the revised version of 45001 based on an effective 18001. Some practical tips for everybody, really. If you were starting from scratch, get a copy of the standard. Obviously, 18001 is the existing, fully published and registerable standard that you can use. You can get registered to that. You can get certificated, etc. You can use 18001. Get a copy of the standard, read it, identify the sources of legal compliance information as the stuff that you'll need to identify appropriate to your organisation, review your hazard and risk assessments and controls appropriate to what you've already got, and if need be, look at a gap analysis to identify improvement points, etc. as the standard against the standard requirements. If you've already got 18001 and you're looking to migrate at some point when they publish the final draft of 45001, there again, when it's out in final draft, read the standard. If you think it's appropriate, or if you have concerns about you don't understand the wording or whatever, you can get external agencies such as ourselves to conduct gap analysis, which would identify any improvements or potential weaknesses within the management system. And don't be frightened of using the standard and doing your own mapping exercise for the management system migration. What have you already got? Conduct your own. You know your business far better than we do. Use your own knowledge and understanding and look at where you are now and where the 45001, when it's published, what that requires, and you can do your own internal mapping and gap analysis exercise, which I would always recommend, regardless of, but obviously the primary thing is you do need a copy or access to a copy of the management system standard to be able to do that. be prepared, be ready. I can't say how long it will take before publication of the 45,001. As you're aware, this is DIS 2. It'll probably go into final draft at some point later this year, but I can't say when the final publication date is scheduled or planned for, because we don't know what level of consultation and changes will be required as part of this consultation period for the DIS 2. So sorry I can't put any firm timelines on that, but remember, you can be prepared, but we can't migrate to the new standard until it is actually published in final form. It's currently at DIS 2. Question and answers. So if any of you have got any questions, by all means, if you'd like to type them in now or whatever, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. We've got about 15 minutes or so left in our time slot. So for those of you who need to know, there are lots of slides and presentations, etc. within this presentation. They will be available from NQA website. We are also recording this webinar so that should you choose to, you can listen to it again at a later date. But all the slides, for those of you who are registered as viewers to this webinar, we will be sending the information out to you in form of the slides, and as I say, the recording of the webinar will be available on the website within the next few days. I'm just having a quick look through one of the questions here. In the opinion of the assessor, does Brexit, Trump election and European elections mean the ISO will be delayed? To be fair, I don't think so. It's more about, in my view, it's more about the ISO committee having confidence that they've made it as good as they can before they go to publication. And obviously, it's a multinational committee that agrees these things. It isn't just UK or individual organisations. So I think, in all fairness, the ISO process will carry on regardless of what's going on around it. I can't see it being significantly delayed because of all the Brexit and changes and elections and various things going on, but who knows? It's very difficult, as you know. I think it was originally scheduled to be published in sort of back end of 2016, early 2017. The primary delay was they couldn't get agreement amongst the committee members to the terminology and phrases and content of the standard, and it's more appropriate that the international standard itself is as good as it can be. So although it's frustrating and disappointing, it's better for the due process to take place and get it as right as we can be, because at the end of the day, hopefully these have a long commercial life. We don't want to be changing standards on a regular basis too frequently, and we need to make them as good as we can pre-launch. And this is why it can take a long time when you've got a lot of members of different committees and various cultures and organisations. Words don't always translate in various languages, etc. So, you know, in all fairness, although it's frustrating, I do think the ISO process won't be unduly affected by the political activities in the rest of Europe and America, etc. Some questions on about there's one about a question about legal legislation registers and aspects and impacts registers. Talking about legal registers and the various things, the minimum it would require depends on your organisation. It's for you to look at your organisation and what your organisation does and the country and area it does it in, etc. as to what so there's no single catch-all, or it needs to at least have X, Y, Z in it. It's very much dependent on your own organisation when it comes to legislation and statutory requirements. There could be local arrangements that are applicable to you. There could be national arrangements. There could be even international arrangements depending on the type of activity that's being undertaken. So there isn't really a basic, oh well, at least if it has that in, you'll have a foundation. And obviously in the UK, you've got the Health and Safety Executive that supports these things. But in other countries, you've got other government agencies who also help support these things. So it does primarily depend on both the organisation and the activities and the location of the activity itself. Next question is, if we adopt the new standard before we're able to get to migrate to the, will the organisation still be able to, sorry, it's difficult to read on my, if we adopt the new standard before, will the organisation still be able to migrate, meet the requirements of 18,001? There are some subtle differences between 18,001 and 45,001, but in principle, there shouldn't be any major gaps. There can be some subtle changes in wording and phraseology, but if you're looking to go for 18, I would say because that's a published and established standard, then you should use that as your guiding principle. And it depends on the individual organisation as to whether you feel it prudent to use the draft 45,001 to establish your system and wait for it to come out. But as I say, if your requirements are such and you feel that your business and your commercial enterprise needs an occupational management system, there is a management system available to you in the guise of 18,001. And to be fair, once you've got that framework and assessment in your organisation, the migration shouldn't be too difficult. The next question. Next question is, because ISO 45001 has to be agreed globally, do you think it would be watered down version of 18,001? No, is my answer to that. You've got to remember, as I said earlier, that ISO 45001 will be at least one of 3 management systems adopted by ISO, and therefore it's trying to use a standard framework requirement for all 3 management systems. So there is some positives there in that if you've already got an existing management system for 9001, for example, which is quality, or 14,001, which is environmental management, the structure of the management system is in principle the same. Yes, the clause requirements are slightly different depending on the discipline, but the basic framework understanding, the Annex SL, the 10 chapters are primarily in principle the same. So, you know, I don't think 45,001 will be watered down, but it can be very difficult to use, you know, what means something in English doesn't necessarily directly translate into another international language. So it can be somewhat difficult to, that's why it takes such an amount of discussion and consultation to get these things published and in the marketplace. Next question. A question here about would there be a significant discount for a combined 9, 14 and 45,001 audit? The current UCAS guidance on integration of management systems is that the integration is 20%, I think. So the maximum reduction could be 20% of whatever the combined days, etc., or time allocated to the management system. The most you could reduce that by is 20% for integration. So I think that concludes all the questions that I've received at this end. As I said, the presentation will be available on the website, and for those registered, we'll be sending out an email, and there'll be a recording of the webinar that you can listen back to. So for my part, I hope that's been useful to you. I hope it's clarified some points. Sorry we couldn't have any more further detail on 45,001, but it is still at DIS. And until we get a final published version, obviously things are all still subject to change. But I'd like to thank you all for registering, and thank you for your interest and your comments and your questions. It's always good to get some questions, because at least it it confirms to me that people are listening and taking note. So thank you very much for that. I hope you all have a very nice weekend, and stay safe. Thank you all very much.